June 4th, 1942, 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The morning sun climbed toward its zenith as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey banked his SBD Dauntless over an empty ocean, fuel gauges dipping toward the red. His entire bomber group scattered across 100 square miles of Pacific, searching for a Japanese carrier fleet that should have been there but was not. The intelligence had been certain. The coordinates had been precise. But the ocean below offered nothing except its infinite indifference, blue meeting blue, at a horizon that mocked them with its emptiness. McCluskey's radio man, Ensign Walter Chokalusek, could feel the tension radiating from the pilot's shoulders as McCluskey checked his fuel for the third time in 10 minutes. They had enough to make it back to the Enterprise, barely, if they turned now. If they kept searching, they were committing to a one-way trip. The entire air group hung behind him in formation, 32 aircraft, waiting for the decision that would mean mission abort or potential death by fuel exhaustion. Standard doctrine was clear. When the target cannot be located and fuel reaches critical levels, return to carrier. McCluskey pressed forward. What happened in the next 17 minutes would transform a lost mission into the pivot point of the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway had been predicted, prepared for, and nearly lost before McCluskey's wing group even launched. American codebreakers had delivered to Admiral Nimitz the rarest of wartime gifts, certainty. The Japanese fleet, 4 carriers strong, would strike Midway on the morning of June 4th. American carriers, outnumbered but forewarned, would be waiting. The plan possessed elegant simplicity. Find the Japanese carriers, strike them while their aircraft were being refueled and rearmed on deck. Destroy Japan's naval aviation capacity in a single coordinated blow. But war reduces elegant plans to chaos with mechanical efficiency. The American carrier groups launched their strikes at different times, from different positions. Torpedo squadrons arrived first and were slaughtered, achieving nothing except buying time with their lives. Fighter escorts became separated, and McCluskey's dive bombers, launched with coordinates based on the Japanese fleet's projected position, arrived at empty ocean because the enemy had turned northeast, away from Midway, toward the American carriers that were hunting them. McCluskey faced the arithmetic of fuel consumption with the cold clarity of a man who had been flying combat long enough to know when doctrine became suicide. His SBD Dauntlesses carried enough fuel for a 4-hour mission. They had been airborne for 2 hours and 20 minutes. The flight back to Enterprise would consume 90 minutes. That left 10 minutes of search time before the point of no return. 10 minutes to find 4 Japanese carriers somewhere in 10,000 square miles of ocean. The manual prescribed a specific search pattern for this scenario. Fly the reciprocal course back toward your launch point, eyes scanning for the enemy fleet that might have passed beneath you. It was logical, methodical, designed to maximize probability of contact while preserving fuel for a return. McCluskey ignored it. Instead, he calculated, the Japanese had not been where they were supposed to be, which meant they had maneuvered. Aircraft carriers do not maneuver randomly. They turn into the wind to launch and recover aircraft. The wind this morning blew from the southeast. If the Japanese had launched a strike against the American carriers, they would have turned northeast. McCluskey rolled into a dive, not the steep combat dive that would come later, but a gentle descent that traded altitude for speed and extended his visual range. He turned northeast on pure intuition, backed by nothing except experience and the gambler's willingness to bet everything on a read of his enemy's intentions. The Japanese carrier captains commanding Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu that morning expected American opposition, but they expected it to be uncoordinated, panicked. The desperate thrashing of an inferior force that had stumbled into battle, unprepared. They had trained for years in carrier operations, had perfected the choreography of launch and recovery, had struck Pearl Harbor and Darwin and Ceylon with impunity. Their doctrine emphasized massed carrier attacks, overwhelming enemy defenses through concentration of force. This morning had reinforced their confidence. American torpedo bombers had attacked in piecemeal waves and been destroyed almost without loss. Japanese fighters controlled the airspace above the fleet. On the carrier decks below, ground crews worked with practiced efficiency, rearming aircraft with bombs for a second strike against the American carriers their scouts had finally located. The Japanese expected to control the tempo of battle, to strike when ready, to absorb enemy attacks with minimal damage. They did not expect an American dive bomber group to materialize from the northeast at precisely the moment when their decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, when their fighters were at low altitude from massacring torpedo bombers, when their defensive formation had been disrupted by hours of maneuvering. They did not expect Wade McCluskey. At 10:17 in the morning, Ensign Chokalusek spotted the wake. A single Japanese destroyer, steaming northeast at high speed, its wake cutting white across the blue. McCluskey saw it instantly, not merely a destroyer, but a clue written in disturbed water. Ships steaming at high speed were either fleeing something or rushing toward something. Doctrine said destroyers screened carriers. McCluskey turned to follow the wake. His fuel gauges now indicated return to Enterprise would be marginal, dependent on perfect navigation and no combat damage. Several of his pilots later reported thinking McCluskey had lost his mind, that he was chasing a single destroyer while the primary targets remained unfound and fuel drained away. But McCluskey pressed on, following that wake like a hunter following blood trail, and at 10:24 the ocean ahead resolved into the geometric shapes that could only be warships in formation, and at the center of that formation, the unmistakable profiles of Japanese aircraft carriers. The dive that followed belonged to textbook execution until the moment McCluskey made it reckless. Doctrine prescribed dive bomber attacks from high altitude, 14,000 feet or above, providing time to establish the dive, aim, and release ordnance with precision. McCluskey's group had burned altitude during their extended search. They approached at 12,000 feet, workable but not optimal. Standard procedure called for gaining altitude before commencing the attack. McCluskey did not climb. He rolled into his dive immediately, committing his entire group to attack from lower altitude than doctrine recommended, gambling that the element of surprise outweighed the tactical disadvantage of reduced dive time. His SBD screamed downward toward Kaga, the aircraft achieving terminal velocity as the altimeter unwound. Behind him, the rest of his group followed, and through fortune's timing, another bomber group from Yorktown arrived simultaneously from a different angle. The Japanese carriers, caught with decks full of armed aircraft and fighters out of position, were gifted to American dive bombers like sacrificial offerings. The bomb that McCluskey released struck Kaga near the amidships elevator. The explosion ignited fuel lines and detonated ordnance on aircraft waiting for launch. Within seconds, Kaga's deck became an inferno. Nearby, Akagi and Soryu suffered similar fates as other dive bombers found their marks. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers at Midway were transformed from instruments of war into funeral pyres. The reckless dive, The decision to attack from inadequate altitude rather than delay had caught the enemy at the perfect moment of maximum vulnerability. Had McCluskey climbed for altitude, had he followed doctrine, the Japanese would have gained precious minutes to spot his approach, to reposition fighters, to clear their decks. Those minutes would have changed everything. McCluskey's aircraft, riddled with anti-aircraft fire during the dive, struggled back toward Enterprise with fuel tanks nearly empty and hydraulics damaged. He landed with less than 10 gallons remaining, enough for perhaps 5 more minutes of flight. 12 aircraft from his group did not return, running out of fuel before reaching their carrier or succumbing to battle damage. The price of the reckless dive was measured in empty bunks and letters home to mothers and widows. But the price of not diving, of adhering to doctrine, of failing to strike when opportunity presented itself, would have been measured in American carriers burning instead of Japanese carriers sinking. The transformation in American naval aviation doctrine that followed Midway elevated calculated risk-taking to strategic principle. The pre-war Navy had emphasized caution, proper procedure, adherence to established practice. Midway demonstrated that wars were won not by those who flew correctly, but by those who recognized the moment when correctness became the enemy of necessity. McCluskey's decision to follow a destroyer's wake on dwindling fuel, to attack from inadequate altitude rather than delay, to gamble everything on intuition and timing. These choices could not be taught in flight school because they lived in the space beyond doctrine, in the realm of judgment that separated competent commanders from legendary ones. The Japanese, analyzing their defeat at Midway in the months that followed, struggled to comprehend how the battle had turned so catastrophically. Their carriers had been superior, their pilots more experienced, their tactical position advantageous. What they had not accounted for was an enemy willing to embrace recklessness when orthodoxy failed, willing to follow hunches into fuel exhaustion, willing to dive from wrong altitudes at wrong times simply because the target was there and the moment was now. Japanese naval doctrine, refined through years of peacetime exercises and early war victories, had calcified into predictability. American doctrine, forged in defeats at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, remained fluid enough to accommodate mad gamblers like McCluskey, who understood that rules existed to be broken when breaking them meant survival. The SPD Dauntless that carried McCluskey through that dive became the symbolic aircraft of Midway, but it was the dive itself, that reckless, too low, too fast plunge from 12,000 feet, when every manual said to climb first, that captured the essence of American tactical evolution. The Dauntless was not the fastest dive bomber, not the most heavily armed, not the most technologically advanced. It was simply adequate, made lethal by pilots willing to push it past its designed parameters, to accept casualties in exchange for decisive results, to recognize that in war, the adequate tool used recklessly often beats the perfect tool used cautiously. In the years after Midway, McCluskey rarely spoke of the decision to follow that destroyer's wake, to dive from insufficient altitude, to risk his entire group on a read of enemy intentions based on nothing except years of experience distilled into instant judgment. When pressed, he would note only that the fuel situation demanded immediate action, that altitude could not be regained in time, that the carriers were there and therefore had to be attacked. He spoke in the language of tactical necessity, but beneath that language lived something more profound. The recognition that command in combat often means choosing between varieties of risk rather than between risk and safety. That the commander's burden is not to avoid danger, but to select which danger to embrace. The ocean that had been empty at 1000 hours filled with burning carriers by 1030. The mathematics of fuel consumption that should have forced McCluskey to turn back became irrelevant against the reality of 3 Japanese carriers ablaze. The reckless dive that violated altitude doctrine, that committed aircraft to attack from disadvantageous position, that traded proper procedure for immediate violence, transformed a lost mission into the decisive battle of the Pacific War. In that transformation lived the essential difference between fighting to survive and fighting to win. A difference measured not in equipment or numbers or training hours, but in the willingness to recognize the moment when all the rules that kept you alive yesterday become the rules that will kill you tomorrow if you follow them today. The dive itself. That screaming descent from 12,000 feet with fuel gauges in the red and enemy carriers filling the bomb site lasted perhaps 40 seconds from roll-in to bomb release. 40 seconds during which McCluskey and every pilot following him committed themselves to a course of action that could not be reversed, could not be aborted, would end in either triumph or death. The Japanese carriers below, their decks crowded with aircraft being armed for a strike that would never launch, represented the accumulated might of an empire that had conquered half of Asia. Against that might, a reckless dive, a gambler's intuition, and 32 dive bombers, flown by men who understood that sometimes foolishness and wisdom wear identical masks. The ocean received the burning carriers with the same indifference it had shown that empty stretch of water where the Japanese should have been, but were not. But history, less indifferent than the sea, marks that reckless dive as the moment when the Pacific War pivoted from Japanese expansion to American ascendancy. When one man's willingness to ignore doctrine and follow a hunch transformed defeat into victory and lost mission into legend written in smoke and flame across the Central Pacific.